Today we're talking about a discussion that will probably never get old. Crit versus pen, power and kin size. If you recall, in a very recent video I talked about the crit build and how even after this patch we will still see Poison Star being built. For quite a while in the SPL, after that Poison Star was actually not built, at least for a week. Now all of a sudden it's being built again without any changes to any of the items, and people kept asking me what they should build now if anything actually changed. Today we're looking into just that. It's actually interesting to see that we've reached a point of balance between power, pen, kin size builds and crit in the SPL for the first time. You will see both builds on a relatively frequent basis depending on the character, the player and so on. A little bit on the matchup as well, obviously. Mostly the players still lean towards power. You will see more power than crit builds at the moment, but the crit builds are already becoming more common again, and mix builds are also in place. So what does this mean for you and what does this mean for the pros? The pros, I guess, have just figured new ways to build that they considered efficient. They knew that with the price change of Poison Star, other items gained value through Poison Star being more expensive again, and especially certain gods just came into play more, namely Medusa being picked up a lot more than before, and as such she does maybe benefit from other items than those gods that were played more frequently before. Medusa is generally an interesting case to look at here, simply because of the variety of builds that we've already seen through the SPL now. The starter item for her is almost always Bluestone Pendant, in spite of many people thinking that Death Toll will be the only way at the start of the season. This is mainly due to the fact that her clear is otherwise relatively weak early on and really facilitates clearing with her too, so it's just almost a mandatory pickup. But other hunters still make use of Death Toll. It's not a bad item all of a sudden, this is just Medusa specific. What's interesting is what happens afterwards. You will see some players going right into Transcendence for the earliest access to power. You will see players going into Warrior Tabi first to get some mobility before going into power. You will see players going into Ninja Tabi in order to get more attack speed when they already get the power from Transcendence. You will see people rushing Transcendence right away instead of going for Bluestone Pendant first. You will see players going for Devourer's Gauntlet. There are so many options right here that it's really hard to say, okay, this is what they will build, this is what you should build or anything like that. That already indicates to you that even the pros consider many of the items somewhat around the same level. Obviously, some pros will have preferences towards one item or the other, but the fact that we would even see Devourer's Gauntlet on Medusa speaks volumes for itself. After that, the builds are different once again. You will still see some players going into Kaival for better boxing. You'll see some going into Hasten Fatalis, also kind of for boxing, but also for higher movement speed. You will see some going into RC for that extra sustain that you don't get otherwise. And even then the builds are different. You'll see many players going into kin size afterwards, this is basically the most logical step here, but you will also see some going into crit. And that makes the overall selection of items very, very interesting. And now let's talk a little bit about what that means for you. First of all, when choosing your hunter, you should always consider what this hunter needs. If your hunter has high attack speed already, has a good attack speed steroid, then obviously you invest less into attack speed, for example Ram or Apollo. You can skip certain items that other hunters need in order to get enough attack speed to be effective, and just go for the more power oriented or whatever version of it. For example, you could go for Titan's Bane over Executioner in that case, if you want to. Just an example, I'm not saying this is necessarily what you should do on these characters, but there are many flex options where you can pass up on some attack speed. Then it's also worth considering if your hunter needs ability damage, if he deals high damage with abilities. If he does, then Transcendence is a great item. At the same time, Transcendence in itself is not the perfect item, so this is something worth keeping in mind. Do you want to stack? Can you sacrifice the time in the build to stack? And if you stack, does it have to be Transcendence? These are questions that you just have to ask yourself, and it's really dependent on the benefit for the specific hunter that you're playing. For example, Apollo or Izanami would rarely make as much use out of Transcendence as Medusa would. Whereas Izanami would not be complete trash the moment she goes into Transcendence, because she still has that ability scaling, I would not recommend doing so, but it's not necessarily something that is bad. On the other hand, if you were to build Transcendence on Apollo, he's not very mana dependent, so he hardly benefits from that, and the rest of it is also not beneficial for him. You'd have to ask yourself, why am I building Transcendence over Devourer's Gauntlet? But that is just the god choice, so that's one factor you have to consider. The next factor you have to consider is the matchup choice. There are many comps that actually run a lot of tankier characters at the moment. You will see the double Hunter 3 Guardian comp or something like that. And against those comps, it does make sense to have some damage that goes through a lot of health. And guess which item does that? Exactly, Sais. So even if your character may not be the best for Sais in any situation or may benefit from crit, it can be worth going into Sais if you're up against a very tanky comp. So even a god like Artemis, who highly benefits from building into crit, who has a kit geared towards crit, can benefit from Sais under specific circumstances. And that's the main point here. Likewise, with crit, you have to consider, is it good for the hunter I'm playing? Am I playing Artemis or Jingwei? I probably want crit. But at the same time, if the situation demands me to build something else, can I get away with no crit? Those situations will clearly be rare, but if you're left with an early game assassin and a relatively early game comp and they don't have anything to meld through tankier targets later, then it's probably gonna be your job. We're not ending there though, and what comes now is, in my opinion, the most important point, and is why I would still defend the crit build as being very viable at the moment. What you have to consider, especially for ranked or casual modes, is that you have to figure out what your role in the game is going to be as the game progresses. If you realize that you're with a good team that will be able to focus on objectives, that will be able to fight as a team most of the time, then you have to be the one who takes the trades. You have to be the one who deals a lot of damage in those fights and deals that damage as fast as possible. And for that, on many hunters, not every hunter, but many hunters, you will seek for something that allows you to give high burst, but also trade with an enemy and maybe take the trade to the next enemy after. For trades, your best option, unless you're against Hou Yi, would be crit, because crit in late game will usually deal more damage. It's not as reliable as to what it is just higher damage if it procs once. And also, with what crit builds offer at the moment, they become more beneficial. This is due to the effect especially of Poison Star. You reduce the enemy's damage and you slow them, and that makes for much better boxing, much better fighting overall, allows your team to collapse on that enemy better, and that's all something that factors in here. So for many characters that look to box, crit is better. At the same time, if your team is very coordinated in a team fight and you're playing someone like Medusa, then you obviously want some power as well, because you want to have as much damage as possible behind your abilities. And power worked with Pen, and Pen worked with Sais, so you can always consider going into Sais instead if going into crit is not an option. On the other hand, power builds themselves are much better for objective-based plays, especially if you combine them with Titan's Bane. Even if you put Titan's Bane in a crit build, you will still not have the high structure damage, for example, because you can't crit structures. Whereas a power pen build will go through structures much quicker. And if you notice that your team won't have the best team fights, there's not the best coordination, you feel like it's gonna be hard for your team to actually emphasize on objectives, then you're much better off with a build that allows you to, for example, push a tower relatively easy. And for that, you can have an item like Transcendence combined with Titan's Bane, then maybe get some sustain through RC and have a build that overall allows for some more power, some more attack speed, some more pen, and all that goes into that direction. In that regard, it's worth keeping in mind that Executioner is usually the better boxing item due to the higher overall stats on the item as long as you're able to hit your basics, but Executioner doesn't do anything against structures or any objective that isn't able to take debuffs from you. So, for that purpose, Executioner is not that great. And as such, there are many things that really tie together when it comes to crit or power and pen and concise, or even a mix of the two. There's no reason not to mix these builds depending on the situation. If I feel like I'm gonna box a lot, then I can obviously go for crit. But if I know at the same time I have to push a lot of structures and my team is not doing that too well, then I would still go Titan's Bane over Executioner, simply because it would function better in that regard, in that very situation, despite not functioning as well as if I was to go for power and percentage penetration through Titan's Bane in the first place. So what this comes down to is at the moment you really have probably the highest amount of choices that we've had in Smite when it comes to hunter builds in a long time. There are many options that will be considered viable depending on the circumstances. You should make sure that there's some synergy between them, so you shouldn't be running Poison Star, Sais, Haste and Fatalis in that order for no reason. But there are also a lot of flexible choices that weren't there before. I would once again like to take Devo Gauntlet's Medusa as an example, who does deal a little bit damage, but also has a better sustain in the laning phase depending on who she's up against, and the damage, while lower, is not that drastically lower that it's never worth building. I personally prefer Devo's Medusa just because I know that I'm gonna be on my own in the lane quite a lot, and the sustain is just better than what I would get from Asi for that time, so I still build regardless of not having the highest amount of damage. And that's something that you should consider for yourself depending on how your games go. With that, thank you for watching. I hope this cleared up some of the questions that were there regarding this topic. Hope to see you for the next one tomorrow. Feel free to leave a subscription if you haven't yet. I'll also be streaming when this video is uploaded, so feel free to stop by twitch.tv/DukeSloth. DukeSloth, out!